An important study recently published by Science Advances proposes a path to effectively protect biodiversity and address climate change in order to meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 through the realization of a global safety net. And we are pleased today to discuss this hypothesis with Dr. Eric Dinerstein, main author of the publication and scientific director of the NGO Resolve, and with Dr. Michele Sofisti, member of the Board of Advisors of Resolve. Good afternoon, and thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Dr. Dinerstein, my first question is about how did this idea of a global safety net originate, and why is this strategy so important, both on a scientific and a political side? And what are the targets you and your colleagues identified that need to be achieved by 2030?
Great. Let's start from the beginning. We face two great existential threats, actually four great threats for the future of nature and humanity. The first is obviously the climate crisis that most people know about. The second is the biodiversity crisis. We're in the sixth mass extinction event in the history of the planet. The third is those species that go extinct, they don't live isolated, they're part of ecosystems. And in some ecosystems, we're actually starting to see ecosystem collapse. And they're all interconnected because as climate changes, some of those ecosystems collapse even faster, which I'll give some examples of. And the last existential crisis is the one that we're living through right now, is a global pandemic. And that's also related to climate change and biodiversity loss. So we have to find a solution that can address all four of those existential threats at the same time, or we won't succeed. And that's the basis for the global safety net. So let's start to unpack this as simply as we can. We realize now that the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are inextricably intertwined. We cannot solve one without the other. And let me give two really clear-cut examples. The first is that, let's take coral reef systems. Coral reefs are the tropical rainforests of the seas. They're where many of the marine species live. Hard corals, coral reef fish, soft corals. If we have a rise of global annual temperature greater than 1.5 degrees C, let's say to 2 degrees, the coral reefs of the oceans will disappear. They bleach and they no longer become homes for these species. And approximately 1.5 billion people rely on protein from coral reefs and the nearshore mangroves to sustain themselves. So that's a real crisis. And the biodiversity is what feeds those people. So here's an example of how the two are intertwined. The other great example is the Amazon in South America. The Amazon right now is a major sink for greenhouse gases. It draws down a lot of the emissions, the CO2 that's emitted each year. It's also the home to the richest assemblage of species on Earth. That's typical of most rainforests, and the rainforests of the Amazon, particularly the Western arc in Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, is the richest by far. It's the diversity of those species that enables the Amazon to be such an effective climate machine of drawing down the CO2. It's the eons of competition among the trees to survive that's perfected their ways of drawing in CO2. And so the biodiversity leads to more effective climate absorption. We lose the biodiversity, we lose that ecological function. We lose the ecological function of these forests because it gets too warm. If it gets over 2 degrees C, the Amazon, particularly the central Amazon, will dry up and it will turn back to becoming a savanna instead of a rainforest, and we'll lose all that species diversity. So it's a vicious cycle, And those are just two examples, but we can see this playing out in many other ecosystems around the world. So that's I think that the first headline of our paper is that everything really is connected and we can't just solve one problem at once. We have to solve it all together.
Why 50% of the land to protect?
Mm-hmm.
And moreover, do we have time to do this, to realize such an ambitious project by 2030?
Yes, I would like to say we have plenty of time, but we don't. We have 10 years, and the other is that we don't have a choice. If this were 1950 instead of 2021, we would have a lot more time to plan more effectively. But because we have procrastinated, the United States included, for hesitating on the Paris Accords or recently stepping outside of it. Hopefully we will rejoin that on January 20th. But the slow speed at which we've reacted to these existential threats then therefore shortens the timeline that we have to fix things. So why 50%? The simple answer is that for life on Earth to continue to thrive, we have to stay below 1.5 degrees global annual rise in temperature. And there is a natural pathway to do that, to stay below 1.5, but it requires essentially keeping all of the habitat intact, the terrestrial habitat intact on the planet, in order to maintain that ecological function of drawing down the carbon. And so what that means is we have a tried and true technology. We don't have to invent anything new. We don't need carbon capture. We don't need pie in the sky technologies that may not be available for 20 to 30 years. A, it will be too late. B, it's very expensive. And C, we don't know that they'll work. When we have the most efficient invention ever created to draw down carbon, it's called a tree. And we can't improve on that. We can just plant a lot more of them, or even better is let the natural vegetation regrow and be restored. And so that's the basis for the safety net, is determining how to do this. And what we also know from our study is that some forests, some habitats are much better at storing carbon than others. And so what we do in our paper is to do the first ever global map of total carbon, so above ground carbon, below ground carbon, and soil carbon, and determine pixel by pixel which areas have the most, and then intersect that with the biodiversity. So where are the areas that give us a double benefit of very high unique biodiversity and they store lots of carbon? Those are the places we should be protecting first. So what we have with the safety net is a complete strategy of basically how to save life on Earth and how to stabilize the climate. And we have to do this within 10 years because the longer we wait to achieve this goal, the more difficult it will be. Now, some people will say it's crazy. You want to protect 50% by 2030. After 2030, there's still going to be emissions. We're not going to stop deforestation. There's going to be fires around. Yes, we're not naive. We recognize that. But what offsets that is we need to sequester about another, let's say, 400 gigatons of carbon. And we can do that through restoration programs. So we can tie together rural development in developing countries, reconnecting intact forests, planting native species, employing local people to build nurseries and plant trees, or just to be guardians of the forest and let them come back. We can do that and draw down that 400 gigatons of carbon. And so we can achieve climate balance by 2030. So there is a pathway. The most exciting thing is it's not going to cost very much. We have analyzed, a paper is coming out, there's one paper already published and there's several more coming out, that there's various ranges of what it would cost to implement this safety net. And the estimates range from like 100 billion to $500 billion a year. That's not as much as we're spending now, obviously, on biodiversity. But if you compare that, or even climate activities, climate-friendly activities, but if you compare that to what we're laying out now to combat the pandemic, it's a fraction of that. And the critical point is the pandemic started because of our broken relationship with nature, and we have to fix that. And we can predict for sure that there are going to be more pandemics in the future. We've already had, since the year 2000, 14 different episodes of what we call zoonotic spillovers. And some of them have been like Ebola, for example, that SARS, that were localized and contained. The coronavirus was not. But we can predict that there's going to be more and more of these zoonotic spillovers, some which could lead to pandemics. The more that we penetrate into tropical forests, the more that people become exposed to the wildlife there, the more that those habitats become fragmented and the wildlife move out from the intact areas. And so if we want to avoid the catastrophe of pandemics, then we have to enact this program. We don't have a choice on the timeline.
If I can add just a note on this point, is about also the permafrost in the northern region, which is melting. And there are already studies showing that who knows what is hidden inside, because we are talking of a thickness very relevant and is melting. So a part of geological disaster is also probably health issues that will come out.
Right. And not only just the release of greenhouse gases from the permafrost and more methane as well, which is obviously, as you know, much more deadly than CO2. There's all sorts of reasons. So let me rephrase this. There was a One Planet Summit on Monday that was hosted by President Macron of France, and also co-hosted by Boris Johnson and the president of Costa Rica. But Angela Merkel spoke at it, and I think the president of Italy as well made some commitments in that forum. And it's great to now see the political will moving towards 30% protected by 2030. That's a great start. It's not enough, it's not fast enough, but it gets us an important way there. There's a second other headline from our paper, which is that the single most important thing that we could do to stabilize the climate and protect biodiversity is to empower and finance indigenous communities to be able to better protect their sovereign lands or gain title to them. Our maps show that the areas with the most amount of carbon storage and the highest biodiversity are in indigenous ownership or claimed by indigenous lands. And if we empowered indigenous groups to the extent possible, we could probably get to 43% of the safety net very quickly. And that last 7% we have to work harder for, but it would be the single most important thing we could do.
But how is the current situation in Europe, and which is the role of Resolve in urging policy to act in this sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's start with the role of Europe. So Europe is a little different, of course. Well, let's just say Western Europe for now. Is a little different than many of the other countries because there's been so much historical habitat loss and conversion compared to much of the rest of the world that it would be impossible, for example, for a number of European countries to achieve even 30% protected. There are some that can and are planning that, like the UK, France, a few others. There are others like Romania that, for example, hold the largest tracts of old growth habitats anywhere in Europe. And that would be a real clear target. So if we think of this as more, if we can just, well, with the European Union, like erase the country boundaries and think of Western Europe as ecosystems, then we can think about where we can have much greater impact on protecting natural habitats. But I think Western Europe is a place where restoration can really have a big impact as well. Restoring both the mammal faunas that have gone extinct but are now reoccupying, like the bears and wolves and lynx that are moving into other, like your Italian wolves have made their ways into France, which is great. And so there are ways that Europe can help in their own backyards to restore wildlife and nature and help draw down the carbon. But I think as a bigger impact can also be as donors. So there are many other countries that have a lot more natural habitat left to conserve without the resources to do that. And as I said, that since it's, you know, a price tag of 100 to 500 billion, somewhere in that range, probably closer to 150 billion, that's a fund that we need to organize that would address all those existential threats. So that's where I think the European countries can play a major role. As for Resolve, beyond the science that we've tried to provide to help guide the safety net, to give it its framework or foundation, we're actively working on trying to address the milestones and targets that we laid out in our global deal for nature, the previous paper, and then the global safety net. And for example, one of the things that we're working on most vigorously is one of the other big headlines of our study is that to address the extinction crisis, in our paper, we showed that beyond the about 15% of the terrestrial realm that's already protected, if we strategically targeted another 2.3%, we could capture the ranges of all the rare species that live in very small areas. Only 2.3%. Now that's not getting to 50%, but it's the lowest hanging fruit, we could say, of if we do this, we could really head off this major extinction crisis. And so what we're working on in Resolve, in our global safety net map, they're pictured in a magenta color. These are the areas that have all the rare species but are currently unprotected. If we focus on that 2.3%, we will have made major steps to avoiding the extinction crisis. So that's one of the big things we're doing. We have a program that just added this called the Quick Response Fund for Nature, that what it does is it targets those areas where we have species that have very narrow ranges. If we lose that habitat, we lose that species forever. We've identified those, and we have created a fund to finance land purchase, working with local groups, working with indigenous groups to better protect those habitats that contain those species.
What is the role and the importance of the private sector in this transition to a sustainable economy and to a new relationship between humans and non-human nature?
I think that is honestly is a relevant role, because as Eric was saying before, the political leaders, they are moving in the right direction. Some of them, of course, not many. But I think that there is a lack of a general public understanding of the problem of the issues, and also the solution that are available, like the global deal for nature. And I think the private sector has shown in all those years that they are really master in communication, and they can sell product because it's the scope of business of the private sector of any kind. And I think if we can attract a fraction of this investment for causes and to protect the living on the planet, because the planet will keep going without us as it was before us. So it's like keeping for future generation the story as we know, and the private sector can be really, really relevant. There are a lot of companies, I mentioned Patagonia as an example, that they are doing things, but I think we need a much more investment and much more constant engagement, and not just here and there. Also because general public, people, citizen, they are electors, and we need that we vote for right people that have the vision to protect the planet, and not some people that we know we have today.
If I could just add to that, it's great that Michele mentioned Patagonia, because they're one of the major supporters of our Quick Response Fund for Nature. And I think that there's tremendous capacity for the private sector to get behind what we're trying to do. In our paper in the Global Safety Net, it's the first ever attempt to ask the question globally, what would it take to connect all of the world's protected areas or intact habitats with corridors, say 2.5 kilometers wide, so that elephants could move from one park to another, or birds could migrate along a pathway? And surprisingly, the answer is we need relatively little. If we did create the safety net and all the layers we have in it, then we'd only need an additional 2.7% of the land area to connect all the world's habitats and basically create the safety net, the threads of the safety net. And we have this idea that we can identify the 100 most important biological corridors on every continent, and then get the companies, the corporations that work in those areas to adopt that corridor and help support local groups to replant forests, to replant the vegetation or just protect it, to allow for the reconnections to occur so that we can have this safety net. And, you know, I think that that's all within reach. But back to the political part, at this same conference on One Planet, there was also a conference, what's called the High Ambition Countries, the HACs. And these are 56 countries that have already signed on to protecting 30% by 2030. And so what we need to do is to get to 200 countries signing on to that and agreeing to it. But we're a quarter of the way there now, and some of the biggest countries have signed on. So I think we're in a good place in 2021. But as Michele says, you know, we need the private sector to weigh in here, because they won't have a market in 10 or 20 years if they don't invest now. You know, we all have to invest in our future, and we do that at Resolve with the science and trying to be strategic about what places need to be protected first and try to find the resources. But then other groups like corporations need to see the reality that the very fabric of our ecosystems is unraveling, and they can do a lot to help put it back together.